Hi, welcome to the New Energy Paradigm Part C, or Part 3. What I've been trying to do is break this new energy paradigm up into smaller chunks so I can produce them faster. Unfortunately, when I separate a little bit of material from the main body of material and try to put a video on it, it ends up expanding. And by looking at something in higher detail, I end up getting better pieces. And you'll see in this video that there's a part, well, we'll talk about that when we get there. And so, trying to keep the videos under somewhere under 20 slides, so it can get a video that would only last about 15 minutes. It keeps expanding up to 40 to 60 pages each time. The material is coming really fast. Things are happening really well. So this is a really good sign. Okay, what is shown in this classically, working energy has been viewed as both a two-body and a one-body phenomenon. I'll explain what that means in a minute. This is another ambiguity caused by the mass hysteria of classical theory. And I'm using this term mass hysteria just to kind of make fun of the fact that we were obscured. This mass thing that we've been using for 300 years has obscured what we were looking at. It's made things confusing for me as well. Okay, so what a two-body is there's a preton to preton energy. In other words, two-body means you have to have two bodies for something, at least two bodies, two or more bodies. That's what two-body means. Okay, and I'm going to show that all the forms of energy that we presently use are two-body definitions, meaning you need two objects in order to have the energy. Okay, then I'm going to show, based on that two-body energy, that there's such a thing as a one-body energy. In other words, and we're going to get into all the discussion. You can read this thing here, but I'm going to talk about this all over again. So this is just a quick paragraph. And the one-body assertion leads to a zero-body assertion. But that's going to be more for follow-on videos because, well, anyway. So the zero-body logic. All right, okay, I said it's going to be for follow-on video. This is just the logic that says there should be zero body. But again, this is just here because I was continuing my thought. You can read this on your own. This is going to be the topic of a later video. Okay, and this slide is not discussed. This is just a placeholder in my notes for possible names for one-body energy and possible names for zero-body energy. And you can pause this and read this on your own. So before we begin, we're going to do this discussion using a mix of classical and new terms to show how classical thinking crippled progress for over a decade, or possibly even 2 decades. So let's get into one-body energy. And so we begin this discussion by talking about the obscuration caused by mass. And this obscuration is an ambiguity, and is covered by the rule of acquisition. And we'll see that the ambiguity we find from the old classical definitions is sometimes some of the energy is looked upon as one body, some of it's looked upon as two body. That's an ambiguity. That's an ambiguity every bit as much as the circular definition. And let me show you some examples of classical energy in both one body and two body forms. Here's the potential energy in a spring. Well, the spring gives you the force, but you still need two masses in order to put energy into that spring. Or you need two things pushing on either end of the spring in order to put energy into a spring. Same with a Coulomb force. It's the same thing. Potential energy kind of looks like one body because we only look at one mass here, but really the acceleration due to gravity is caused by the mass of the Earth. So it's really two body as well. And there is a one body form. Kinetic energy. In the equation for kinetic energy, it's 1/2 mv squared, and there's no other body here. And so here, all the other forms are two body, except this one is curiously one body form of energy. Well, that got fixed by the new energy paradigm because we realized that inertia is a two body phenomenon, which it used to be called mass. And so now, because of ethereal mechanics, we can now describe all former versions of energy as two-body forms of energy. So presently, all accepted forms of energy are two-body, which means, it's an interaction between two pretons, preton to preton, at the pretonic level. This ambiguity is now resolved, but it leads to an interesting realization. If protons never touch, then the construct of energy is really a communication between protons through the ether. In other words, the action of proton A issues a field that traverses hit B and vice versa. But it looks like a circular definition, which is in violation of the rule of acquisition 17. And this is just the introduction slide. You can read that on your own. But we learn that time heals all. Considering that it takes time for the effects of one proton to reach the other and time for that effect to return, we no longer have an ambiguity. And let's look at the mathematical definition of the circular definition. We can see that we're now no longer in violation. Because without time, then A is A, that's a circular definition, that's completely useless. And also, if we look at A at T1 and A at T1, well, that's also a circular definition, which is completely useless. But we look at A at T2, we're comparing it to A at T1, well, that's okay. That shows you have, that means that the A doesn't change over time. That shows consistency. And if you want to look at, the change in A over time, well, if you consider them at the same time, you get an undefined state. But if you show them at two different times, well, then you have a rate of change of A, which is okay. Okay, so having a definition that spans time is fine. So we can have a circular system. But then this leads to a one-body postulate. Okay, since a proton is only ever touched by ether, then a proton can only acquire or lose energy to the ether. Logically, then, there must be a more fundamental description of work and energy, which is definable in terms of a single proton and its coupling to the ether. Furthermore, in order to have propagation delay, the energy that couples to the ether must be maintained in a state of the ether while it travels between protons. And therefore, ether must be able to store and transmit this energy without protons. Therefore, there must exist a construct of energy which is not defined in terms of protons, just defined in terms of states of the ether. This is what we call zero-body energy, or the ether-to-ether energy. Now, you might say, well, okay, well, that's two-body ether to ether. That's two bodies here. Yeah, okay, great. But at least we're not talking in terms of protons. We're talking in terms of states between ethereal particles. Now, at this writing, I know there's a lot of people that are wondering, well, how do you know the ether is composed of particles? And it really doesn't matter. Because in the grand scheme of things, we can model anything as a system of particles, even if it's not, and get good answers. When they do waveguide calculations, they shoot electromagnetic radiation down as it's a bunch of particles. And it works out very well. So even though, radio waves are waves, maybe waves on the ether, the simulation uses as it's spraying out a bunch of particles, and it gets reasonably good results. So we can mimic things with particles, even if it's not composed of particles. So, as long as we get good answers that are useful, it really doesn't matter what mimicking or modeling technique you use. As long as your modeling technique agrees with the results obtained by nature, then it's useful. But we're going to hold off this zero-body stuff for a later video and continue on with the two- and one-body stuff. Okay, this is a little segue, but this is new electromagnetism, and both new and old electromagnetism apply propagation delay as nada. Because we're talking in terms that we need to fix this with time, there should have been a little segue slide here that was missed. Because we need to use time to make things okay to be in a circular system, and I don't mean circular that it travels in a circular path. What I mean is a system that sends energy to one particle and the energy goes back. It doesn't necessarily have to be a circular system. This is like I'm trying to find a name for this, a self-regenerating system. Let's use that term. So in order to have a self-regenerating system that does not violate the rule of acquisition 17, we need time delay. And in classical theory and in new electromagnetism, we both apply time delay as an add-on to the models. In this case, this is new electromagnetism version 4. But the interesting thing is that classical theorists are not sure how fast electric or magnetic fields propagate. And we're going to talk about that a little more in a little video because it ends up giving another cut to Maxwell's equation, but we'll talk about that later. But new electromagnetism has rationalized it that these fields can only travel at the speed of light. Now, that's a rationalization that we'd be willing to change if we found evidence to the counter, but right now we don't have such evidence, so we're going to use it until it doesn't work anymore. And so the way is clear. Propagation delay resolves the rule of accuracy 17 concern and will be accounted for in models when the time comes. For now, we still have a lot we can discern using the instantaneous models, and let's get everything we can get out of the instantaneous models before we go on. But at least we know we have a way out when it comes time to deal with problems involving what would be a self-regenerating system. So now that we've rationalized that two or more particles can exist in an intercoupled, or I guess what I'm calling this is a self-regenerating system, the next step breaks down into that two-body system into its component one-body energies. Again, we're going to save the zero body for later. And the problem that crippled progress for the longest time is in the classical definition of energy, force times distance is the definition. And you can only put energy into a system if it can react to your applied force. It's like, you have an opposing force in a two-body or the inertial reaction of a mass. And so how can energy be defined in terms of a lone proton that you can't apply force to? Because you can't apply force to something that's inertialess, at least in classical terms. And let me demonstrate. I have this little controller here, but because this controller has inertia and it even has friction on the thing, that when I apply force to it, I can feel it pushing back against my applied force. Okay, but if I have this stuff that's even lighter, let me just use a piece of paper, okay, which is much lighter than that. Well, now trying to push this, I can't even feel it. It's like almost imperceptible in touch. That's because there's less reaction to me. And therefore, I can't put as much energy into this. Okay, so if the force that I'm applying times the distance is the energy, I'm putting a lot more energy into this than I'm putting energy into this over the same distance, because I can't even feel the reaction force. And so the question is, how can you put energy into something that doesn't react to you? A proton has no reaction. According to the definition of proton, it has no inertia. Well, two wonderful developments have fixed this problem. In the new energy paradigm, it has produced many breakthroughs, but two of the breakthroughs solve this dilemma. Let's review what those breakthroughs are. The change of state rule. Changing the state of something requires an expenditure of energy. Thus, if protons are spinning as parts of a secondary system of protons, then work is being done on the protons. And actually, in the next video, we come to the conclusion that you have to drive protons to move them through the ether, and so there is a reaction from the ether. We'll get to that later. So we do have that. And the other one is mass murder. Starting with the classical definition of energy on the top, okay, and then what we're going to do is insert new induction for the force, and then we divide Km by everything, and now we find that our new definition of energy does not really require inertia. There's no inertia in here. All there is charge acceleration, or charge and acceleration. I don't know how we want to break that up. And so we no longer have to have a reactionary force. All we have to do is cause protons to accelerate. Once we accelerate protons, we have energy. And we don't have to worry about the reactionary force anymore. Now remember, this is only a baby step. This is not the final word, but it's a step in the right direction. We have much to go. This is still a two-body definition, but at least it's free of inertia. And it's free of the necessity to have the body react to you in order to put energy into it. And so we're free of that requirement from classical theory. But this is only a step in the right direction. There's lots farther to go. And since all of our field models describe force acting on a proton, then force is the means by which energy is converted from one type to the other. Now, you might be confused. You say, wait a minute, you just said you didn't need force anymore. Well, yeah, but the new definition of force it alleviates that problem with inertia as well. And so everything, by getting rid of Km, we have fixed all the problems, all the obscuration caused by inertia. Or the unnecessary, I'm sorry, not inertia, but the the new force, thrust, is the means by which energy is converted from one type to the other, whether it be kinetic to potential or vice versa, or pretonic to ethonic, and I'm using this prematurely now, or vice versa. But our present definition of force is a two-body definition as well, but this is easy to resolve. Okay, so our new definition of force, which is thrust, because we don't have km in there anymore, converting it into Newtonian force. This is new ethereal mechanics force, which is thrust. It's free of the the mass obscuration. But what we can do in order to break this down, see, what we have here is we have an action of a source charge accelerating, and at a distance r, it can apply thrust to a target charge. So what we can do, like they did in classical theory, they would divide both sides by the target charge, and then you have electric field. And that's what we're going to do. But we're not going to use E for electric field because that might confuse people. Excuse me. Instead, we're going to divide both sides by target charge, and we're going to call this a motive field. In other words, a preton motive field or a charge motive field, or what do you want to call it? We're just going to call it a motive field for now. And so what this describes is the properties of the ether where the target charge is. And there's no requirement that this motive field has to come from an electromagnetic equation. There could be other things that can cause motive fields. But right now, the motive field is the one unified thing. It's the same units for every type of force that creates it. And also looks kind of cool because it's magnetic in origin too. And so now we have new electromagnetism version 4C. Where now M is a charge motive field or a preton motive field. We haven't really defined the name, but just calling it motive field for short. And so we have Coulomb's model, we have the magnetic models, and we have new induction. Let's go on a tangent of new electromagnetism. One of the goals is to determine the field interaction between pretons, what we call the pretonic field equations. We're actually going to begin that definition earlier than normal it's going to be in the next video coming up, because in producing that video I had an epiphany, and it made sense to move the beginning of the pretonic field definitions early, because I had a little bit of a breakthrough. Okay, new electromagnetism represents the effects that we can measure between two second-order systems of pretons, which would be like electrons. So these are really the electronic models, not really the pretonic models. And this represents a lot of obscuration. For example, the electron, right now our model of it is two pretons in some kind of second-order orbital of each other. It doesn't necessarily have to be circular, but we're just showing the circle for brevity here. And this we look on as a single electron. I put the little minus signs here to make it look like an E. And so this electron has fields that are emanated, and these fields are produced by these pretons in a dance about each other and all the different fields that they weave when they do their second order thing. Okay, and so when we try to take a measurement, we're not really measuring preton to preton effects, we're measuring the coupling between these two complex systems. So that's the problem. That's what we're measuring when we measure things electronically. Okay, we need to fully understand the second order system of pretons in order to be able to break down and know what the preton to a preton effects are. But in the next video, I had an epiphany, so we may actually be able to get a lot of that stuff out easier by using logic, but we'll see. So the simplest electronic measurements that could be made involve at least 4 pretons, probably more. So we have to be very careful about the assumptions and conclusions. Now here's an interesting part. I came up with a way in the next video to put a little bit more evidence to this. Right now, this is just purely an assumption just by looking at it. In the next video, I actually came up with a way that we can show that that's a synthesis. Or let me not say prove it, but at least give more evidence to corroborate it's a synthesis. Okay, and so when I made this slide, it was more of a loose assumption. And this guy, I was under the loose assumption that this was a pure pretonic effect. In the next video, I'll show you it based on the new epiphany that came through. This is very close to the true pretonic effect. And these are still going to be nebulous, but at least we have a little more evidence on what to look for and where to go, and that's going to be more in the next video. So what should we expect? Well, some of the electronic fields that we measure are going to be the pure pretonic effects coming through, or they are going to be byproducts of synthesis. You know, as the pretons do all their fancy stuff and their dance about each other, they're going to be creating and weaving all kinds of, synthesizing all kinds of effects that aren't normal as part of a pretonic field. And this is analogous to how all chemical elements are synthesized by different arrangements of protons, electrons, and neutrons. Yeah, there you have basically 3 little particles that can synthesize everything from gold to water to whatever to whatever. And it's just how you arrange them. And that's the same thing that I'm making with fields, that the electronic fields that we measure are the synthesis of the pretonic fields as the pretons do their dance. And they basically, like Rumpelstiltskin, they weave the fields that we measure at the electronic level. Okay, once we have a reasonable second-order system of preton model and pretonic field model, the idea is to use these, put them together, and be able to resynthesize. Because remember what one of the rules of accuracy, I don't remember the name, is you guess down and derive back. So once we have a good guess of these two, then we use them and derive back to the electronic level to see if we can match all of the electronic models exactly. And so if we do things right, the effects should match. If we're lucky, we'll unveil new effects, likely to be very small, that would then be able to be measured and corroborate, not necessarily prove, but in other words, if we measure these effects now at the electronic level, and they're there, that would at least corroborate that our models are good, not necessarily prove them. Because again, you can get correct answers with complete fantasy. But it may still make them useful because now we have a model of this new effect we didn't know before. So at least we're getting closer to the truth. That's the end of the tangent. Okay, the motive field. Getting back to the motive field. The motive field is generated by pretons and affects pretons. The next step is to figure out enough of the interactions to make progress. Right now, a motive field could be either a construct of ether, a state of ether, or maybe just a separate emission altogether. And we must be open to the idea that there may be more than one type of motive field. We'll assume one type as a starting point. So the following is a logical development of an abstract interaction between motive and pretons. It is the best representation I've been able to come up with right now. And again, it should be only viewed as a gateway to develop the science to a point where we can make a corroborating experiment. So here is the interactions that make sense. Essentially, somewhere else in the universe, a preton has emitted a motive field. That motive field then strikes another preton somewhere else in the universe. And when you work a preton, this is new now, when you work a preton, working a preton causes it to feed, and the waste product of that feeding is the emission of another field. Now this field emanates spherically. I'm only showing this little lightning bolt because it's going to link into the next slide. So forgive the crude representation. Okay, that emitted field then strikes another preton, which causes it to feed, which moves it, causing it to feed and emitting another field, which then strikes the original one. And that way there, we can define a self-regenerating system. And this thing goes around and around and around. And this is like a chain reaction. A self-regenerating system of feeding and energy emission, and this is essentially a circular chain reaction, or a regenerative chain reaction, what do you want to call it. Now it's contained in an orbital. That's what we're calling this containment. We're calling it an orbital, which it is. An orbital could have a particular shape, and we're using the word orbital because it comes from chemistry, and we know as atoms get bigger and bigger and bigger, the pretons take on different orbital shapes. And we're preparing to use the same terminology. That's why we're calling it an orbital. And we're showing it as circular right now. That's just for brevity and ease of drawing. But essentially, this is a circular, self-regenerating chain reaction that keeps the preton in orbit. And so if there's insufficient ether for one or both pretons to feed on, then they can no longer emit a sufficient motive field. This unlocks their embrace in each other, breaking the orbital apart, and the system flies apart. Essentially, all matter is made of these tiny pretonic reactors, which are essentially tiny, continuous supernuclear explosions that fold in on themselves. If the orbital is broken, then the genie is released. The universe sees little difference between these two systems, whether you got the earthling or the matter that makes up a star. If we took a representative sample of the orbitals from both systems, you'll see in the earthling that all of the systems are well fed and they're stable. On the surface of the sun, where ether is, you've got a lot of mass competing for the same amount of ether, somebody ain't going to get fed, and that somebody is going to blow apart. And so a nuclear inferno is just a slight leak. You only need a tiny fraction of orbitals to break to have what we see as a nuclear inferno. This is essentially the true nature of matter leaking out. Now, contrast that you with Uncle Albert. He said matter is frozen light, which doesn't help us, because if matter is frozen light, then we cannot make an argument for ether consumption. If ether consumption is doing work, then we have to have a very dynamic system that's doing a lot of work internally in order to have an argument that we need to feed on ether. That's why the Uncle Albert explanation doesn't make any sense at all, because it would not be able to argue why does something that's inert have to feed? Okay, and we're showing a completely different story here. We're showing that matter is a raging supernuclear inferno which folds in on itself. The energy emitted by stars is just a slight leak of the true essence of matter. And let me give you a note. I'm using the term supernuclear inferno, which folds in on itself. I'm using this nuclear inferno terminology because it's the most powerful and frightening term in the present vernacular and conveys a general idea without having to invent new terminology. I'm trying not to invent new terminology if I don't have to. Okay? But the word super is added to show you that it's superior to a nuclear. In other words, it's the more primordial. It's a much bigger reaction. What we get, when one orbital breaks, is just one of many that break. Okay, and and the interesting thing is, unlike when you have a nuclear explosion or the sun, you get a lot of debris. We call radiation, particulate radiation. Okay, that's because the energy release from the orbitals crashed into other orbitals and disturbed them in such a way that stable particles were able to fly off. And so you get these stable particles that are toxic to us. They may be quasi-stable. So you get a lot of random debris. And it shows us that pretons can form a lot of different particles. And only 3 of them are long-term stable in our universe. That would be the proton, electron, and neutron. Okay, there are others that have varying levels of stability. And those would be like radioactive isotopes and all this other stuff. Okay, because ether consumption is, according to this theory, the fuel of matter, it's not only fuels the inferno, it also fuels the containment. Again, we come back to the idea from video 47 that matter maintains stability from 2 orthogonal forms of energy being in balance. Thus, ether must also be capable of orthogonal energy forms, or perhaps it's a binary medium as contemplated in earlier videos. Now, in one of the other earlier videos, I came up with a number for $17 trillion per cubic meter. And now that we've dispelled the frozen energy paradigm of classical theory, we can see the incredible amount of active work going on in matter, which requires an incredible amount of fuel to keep it in balance. The need to feed. And so we're on the path here to develop a rational ether consumption model. When I developed the ballpark value of energy in the cubic meter, where the cubic meter was coming out to be $17 trillion per cubic meter of ether, I was hesitant to release it because it just seemed too outrageous. But now I don't think the number is too far off, and we're going to see when the final models come out, which it might be a few weeks, it might be a few months. I can't tell how quickly these things are going to go. I'm hoping it's a few weeks. And so a drop of gas, energy contained in the chemical bonds of a drop of gas, what we fuel our cars with and other things, is totally insignificant to the energy contained in the orbitals of the matter that makes up the drop of gas or a drop of water or a drop of anything. Okay, so it's ironic that nations are preparing to go to war over the remaining pockets of fossil fuels. We are retarded monkeys. Swear to God. Okay, now that we have a conceptual framework for motive field pretime, we begin the translation to a mathematical framework. That's where we pick this up in the next video. But you're going to see in the next video that we're actually going to segue, and you'll just have to wait for the next video to see. Thank you very much. I am so sorry that this ended up being so much longer, but I think there's a lot of good information coming out and things are happening well. I thank all of my Patreon, or patrons, I guess you want to call them. And for the bridge level officers, I promised that we need to get together and have a chat. I've got to figure out how to do that. So bear with me. I'm going to try to set something up I'll give more detail about that forthcoming.